Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out at procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And in today's conversation, I talk with Sherri Barnes, Director of Market Intelligence Services, and Kristen Rellihan, Senior Manager of Advisory at ProcureAbility. Our conversation took place during a recent AOP live webinar where we talked about how procurement professionals can develop strong buying strategies despite uncertain market dynamics. Sherri is an economist by trade, so it was really interesting to get a perspective on our current inflationary environment. And then we got down to tactics. What can we do to mitigate, manage, and take advantage of times like today where market conditions are changing quickly? So let's jump straight in, where I start by asking Kristen if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
So the answer is a little bit of both. My educational background is in supply chain, but when I entered the professional world in consulting, I was placed within procurement, within supply chain. So it was a bit of luck from that perspective, but I stuck it out. I loved it. My career kind of grew that way and really evolved more from like technology transformations around procurement to more of the sourcing and procurement focus. So a little bit of both.
Yeah, even starting with supply chain from a background perspective is probably puts you ahead of 90% of folks in the profession in terms of, how they landed in procurement.
Exactly.
Sherri, I'm going to ask the same question to you. Did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Well, I don't know. I think Kristen's pretty far ahead of me on this one. Philip, I'm a wanderer. I've wandered all over the different places in my career, I think. So I'm not sure if it is a little bit of both. Procurement found me, and I think I found procurement. And most of the stuff that I work in, as you said in your introduction, is around market intelligence, understanding market dynamics, and sort of what's going on and pricing and demand. And so most of my background tends to be more in economics.
Right. So let's start there. I want to open the conversation just by having a little bit of a level setting. Where are we today? What are you seeing out there? Sherri, you're in the market all the time, kind of looking, as you said, from an economic perspective, from a market dynamics perspective. How can we make sense of what's going on today?
I think that's the $6 million question if we have such a one today. As you know, and as Kristen knows, this is a super challenging market environment. I think the conditions are kind of, let's see, I think the technical term is crazy, Philip. I think market conditions are pretty wild and pretty crazy. We've got high inflation across a number of categories. It kind of started with commodities. It moves to finished goods. From finished goods, it sort of moves to freight and then into labor. I think that one of the things that's sort of surprising us, I think everyone on this call is aware of inflationary conditions. You see that in what you're doing professionally. You see it in the market baskets you buy at the grocery store every day for your personal consumption. But one of the things that's a bit surprising is when I start kind of explaining to people just the magnitude of what the inflationary effects are. And if you haven't seen them directly impacting what you're buying and what you're doing for your organizations and your clients, today, you will certainly see it very quickly tomorrow because, you see on the news perhaps that inflation at a broad standard is running, say 5, 6, 7% and may close the year at, 6, 8, 10, 9%, somewhere in that. But when you think about percentages of where we're at on commodities, steel, some grades of steel are up 200%. Freighting coming from Asia is up 400%. Gasoline is at a 5-year high and is 45, 55% over where it was last year. We thought that oil was going to close at $80, a barrel this year, and that's been stretched to $100 a barrel. And those are pretty significant and large, kind of impacts that come across. And so that's sort of rolling all the way through. And as a lot of what we're going to talk about is trying to see, manage, anticipate what that next phase is as it comes around. And that's before I even start talking about labor markets and labor tightness and the things that are going to kind of go on to that. So crazy. That was my my opening descriptor. Would you agree that maintains where it should be, right?
Certainly from my perspective, that's what I see. And what's interesting to me, and maybe there isn't an answer to this, is whether this is structural. So it's, the nature of supply markets have changed in that this isn't going to be, just as a result of short-term supply and demand imbalances, or whether it really is short-term supply and demand. It spikes and it's going to come back down again. I'm sure it differentiates based on the products, the markets, the services, whatever the underlying cost drivers are. But do you have an opinion on whether this is kind of the start of a trend, or whether this is a spike in response to all the crazy that's gone on in the last 18 months?
I think everybody has an opinion, and it depends on whether they're standing at the gas pump or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
The key operative word that you hear is transitory, and there's a lot of disagreement about transitory. And one of the things that I've been trying to share with folks internally and externally to ProcureAbility is the very nature of transitory and how long that can be.
Mm-hmm.
To you and I, perhaps as a consumer, we think of transitory in terms of weeks or perhaps months, but maybe to an economist, they may think of transitory in a much longer elasticity period. So one of the things that I think that we're seeing is that transitory in this case is going to certainly extend through 2021, which might not have been what you thought earlier on. And it looks like it's going to really heavily impact 2022. And some of the latest things that I've been reading about in the economic consensus is that we probably won't see a relenting of these conditions until at least 2023. Mm-hmm. And that just sort of began to come out and be kind of conversational here in the last week or two. So I think that structural, I don't know. I'm kind of a little touchy about that word, but I think that procurement, I think in one of your messages about this session was that no matter what the market conditions are, procurement has to find a way to succeed. So It seems to me, and I know Kristen has some opinions about this too. It seems to me that it doesn't much matter really whether it's transitory in terms of today or tomorrow. What matters is we have to deal with what we're dealing with right now, and that's an environment of rapidly increasing prices and labor market tightness and resulting shortages. And having to be that and understand that and being able to deal with that is really today's issues, not just today's topic on our conversation, but just really today's issue.
And Kristen, I wanted to come over to you just to ask if if the observations that you're having from your perspective kind of marry with what Sherri's seeing, or perhaps any additional color that you may say from, when you're talking to procurement folks every day in terms of how it's impacting them and their work on a day-to-day basis. You're seeing that out in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think it's a really exciting time to be in procurement right now, because oftentimes procurement's fighting to have a seat at the table, right? To have a voice in the overall process. Everyone likes to have, their negotiating hat on, right? And we're often challenged with contracts or, different things being thrown over the fence just to execute, just to process, right? And procurement is viewed as it's very, transactional in nature. But when you're dealing with this kind of market and this environment, procurement, it's our time to shine, right? It's our time to bring all of the research and insights and talk about the trends and the theories and the approaches that we've been trained and execute on when given that opportunity. So it's our chance right now to really help demonstrate the value that we can bring to the bottom line, to availability of product, and to help businesses continue running with the products and services that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because we always say to be strategic in procurement, you need to show up with data and insights that go beyond what your stakeholder has. Mm-hmm. Your stakeholders can believe, and because they do, they're experts in a particular market because that's what their professional expertise is. But now provides us an opportunity to come with additional insights and opinions and tactics because of that data that perhaps goes beyond what they see in a supply market. And we've been crying out for that as an opportunity to show that the value that we can bring in some categories for a long time.
Absolutely. And I think taking those insights from our customers, right, internally, they're valuable. Like that is an input that we need as part of our procurement strategy. I need to hear what they say, right? I need to hear what the suppliers tell us as well, an incumbent or someone that we're looking to do business with. All of their inputs are valuable, but they can't be the only input. And that's, again, where procurement comes in to say, thank you, right? That's great information. Let me dig a little further. I want to talk to all the stakeholders. I want to ask you some questions about your experience and how these contracts are working today, or what your future needs are, right? To understand what's really happening and what you really need. And then I'm going to come back, right? And I'm going to provide you with a thorough, non-biased market description of what's happening today and what's our approach, right? How do we take all of this information that we've gathered and how do we put it together into an approach that is actionable?
Now, I want to just come back, Sherri, to something you said when you were kind of giving the overview of where we are here, towards the end of 2021, and you talked about labor market tightness. We always, well, I don't say we always, oftentimes we think about inflation and inflationary pressures as being specific to commodities. You talked about steel. We've had lumber going up and down this year, the cost of oil and therefore the gas prices, not necessarily services. What are you seeing? There's a lot of press right now about the Great Resignation and the difficulties in keeping talent. I wonder if you're seeing that translate, or if you're not seeing it translate today, if you expect to see that translate into inflationary pressures from a services perspective too.
I love all these coinages that we come up with, right? The taper tantrum, the Great Resignation. All of that makes me smile. I think I kind of see this as a rolling kind of thing, Philip. But as I mentioned, the commodities start, and then finished goods, and then freight, and you can sort of see that build. And I think the similar trend direction can be seen in labor markets, where it typically starts in what I would maybe call the lower echelons of labor, which is perhaps entry level or certainly just general labor type things, and then it moves to skilled labor, and then it moves more to professional labor, and I think that is that especially in skilled labor that I had already seen market tightness becomes much more stretched, much more fast. But managing this labor condition where there are more jobs than not, and then there are workers is a definite problem who is growing in magnitude and in interest. And I think that for some managers, I think that that's a little bit of a surprise, because they're catching news reports that indicate that unemployment is out there, and they feel that they shouldn't really be seeing that, and yet they have a position or they have staff vacancies that they didn't expect. And so that's the difference between what they're hearing or seeing and what they're experiencing. And again, I think we have to kind of just go back to it is what it is, and it isn't what it isn't. You can call it what you want, right? But in the end, you need people and you don't have them.
Which can lead to different strategies in the services categories, where not that I would necessarily advocate for a cost first or a price first approach in a lot of services categories anyway, but you can, where historically maybe that's been part of the discussion, is to try and look at labor rates and the cost reduction potential. You can push the cost down so much where the suppliers just can't hire anybody anymore. So because the rates are so low, because they're just going somewhere else. So that's going to be something that we kind of have to contend with now from a services category strategies perspective.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think I think that that's sort of the case, whether it's a managed goods category, a services category, or a finished goods category. I think all of that together is coming into play, where we are now shifting or pivoting from a situation where we had very lean supplies. We were really driving to the least cost and providing great efficiencies in the supply chain, to now recognizing that risk and risk factors are very important in this, and perhaps the leaning of the supply chain. I don't know, is it, what do we call this, Kristen? We call this fattening the supply chain? That seems kind of odd, but maybe adding or building in a little bit more resilience is as important a goal, as important a success factor as perhaps in previous couple of years the leaning was.
Yeah, it's funny. I read an article just over lunch today that actually called it fattening of the supply chain. So
Did
maybe
they
that's
really?
a term. Yeah, so maybe that's a term that's going to enter our lexicon over the
Well,
next.
it seems quite awkward, but I'm glad to hear that someone else said that first.
I want to talk a little bit about how to leverage supply market intelligence. We've talked about where the trends are, what you're seeing. I think for a lot of procurement professionals, we're kind of challenged in one, getting that data and knowing where to go to get that data. And then, of course, how can we put that into action? How can we translate that into some impact? Kristen, from your perspective, like one of the places we often go as procurement folks is stakeholders and suppliers and look for insights from them, perhaps because they're the most accessible places for us to go. Are they a reliable source of market insight in your experience?
I do think so. I mean, I think you have to get information from all parties, right? And you've got to be a researcher in this stage of the procurement game. Early on, your job is to really set the stage and understand what's happening from all the different factors. So talking with stakeholders and interviewing them, from the folks that are placing the order, managing the order, to the people that might be, touching the products that are coming into the warehouse and understanding what that looks like, getting all of that feedback to understand what's happening, what are they hearing, what are they experiencing, and then hearing from the suppliers as well, probably a bit more biased, right? But what can they provide you? When you start, asking questions of them and, conducting some of your research from their perspective, you really can glean some great nuggets of information to help you think about what should I research next, right? What door should I open next to try to better understand the reality of the situation and piece this all together so that you have a great understanding of the market.
So how can we get some information from a supplier, let's say, and like you said, that supply information can be a little bit more biased, or there can certainly be the possibility that it's a little bit more biased in their favor. What are some of the things that we can do to actually validate what a supplier may be telling us in terms of, for example, hey, these input costs have increased, or, there's pressure on supply over here, and so I'm having to pay, some premiums to be able to get what I need. What do you recommend in terms of where to go to make sure to sanity check whether that's real information or whether that's a little bit inflated?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to put just as much effort into confirming what they say as you do is proving it wrong. So you've got to try and really look at things from both sides, right? Use reliable sources, talk to folks like Sherri who can help you to, gather as much market intelligence as possible from there, right? Pulling new suppliers into your base, right? And looking at who could be a challenger in here versus this competitor that's telling me things right now. And really seeking to balance out the scales.
Yeah, I think so too. If I could jump in here for just a second, Philip, I think that a lot of times that what we find when we work with our teams and our clients and our procurement sort of work that we do is that will come in through someone with one of Kristen's teammates, and then it will come to my team to sort of validate that out. And we'll do that by looking at independent measures like PPIs, CPIs. We'll pull what the cost factors are. We know if you're looking at, the cost of a loaf of bread, then we're going to be looking at what were wheat commodities doing and what were the electricity prices doing and what happened with freighting, sort of to understand the loaded cost of that loaf of bread and then sort of be able to bounce back or validate that just a little bit. I think like a lot of things, there's an immediate thing. We can do some short-term things right away, and then we can look at things on a little bit more medium or longer-term horizon.
Yeah, are there some typical sources that you go to, Sherri, for like public information sources, or where are you gathering your insights from, as much as you're able to share when you're putting together that picture?
For sure, absolutely. A lot of what we get is in the public domain. The U.S. government is probably one of the most commonplace sources of economic data in the universe. So we get that from less and the EIA and the Census Bureau and BLM and several other three-letter organizations, right? And then we have some that are paid sources as well, like AMM or some of the London exchanges, LME, those kind of things, to look at specific commodities. Some things are a little easier to get than others, and some things are a little bit different. And then we look at whether we're looking at domestic markets, international markets, or different parts of cargo shifts.
Kristen, I want to come back just kind of on that thought, and I just want to encourage anybody, if you do have questions today, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A panel. I'm going to come over to Kelly in a moment or two just to see if we've got any questions in so far. But one of the questions is around, as we're thinking about gathering, thinking about market intelligence, should we be gathering the intelligence and then using that to determine spend strategies? Or you kind of built your strategy and you're wanting to validate whether that's the right strategy by looking for data? Like, which is the right way about going and doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a chicken and the egg type of question too, right? You can go either way, but regardless, as I had said before, it's really about, if you come into a project with a hypothesis, you have to make sure that you fairly are researching to disprove that hypothesis as much as you are as proving it, right? So we have to challenge ourselves to be fair and unbiased as well when we're creating assumptions and developing strategies, because if we're not, then sometimes the obvious that's out there, we're too far down our path of already having that assumption, and we have to be open to realizing our hypothesis might not be the right way, right? The strategy that we were seeking to prove might not end up being the appropriate way to go, and we have to be open-minded enough to be able to see it through our research.
Right.
And I think from my perspective, Philip, not to jump too far into that, I think that earlier that we can start looking at market intelligence and including that into the process. I think it strengthens our chances of successful outcomes, because the first thing that you want to do before you start any project is, well, where are we really at in the market conditions? I mean, what's really happening in that category and around that.
Right. If I could just follow that just up, that, the strategic sourcing is the event, right? Like, that's what's happening right now, but we should be managing the category and constantly looking at what's happening, right? So that that hypothesis that we've already formulated is because for the past, 6, 12 months, however long, we've been, refreshing the category strategy and the plan and what we're looking at within this space, so that, again, it's current, and that it's taking into consideration kind of all of the market conditions that are happening. So it shouldn't just be a point in time event. There should be a lot coming into it, building it up.
Yeah, and taking a step backwards even, or further up, looking at it from a wave planning perspective, to see kind of the trends at the macro level that are happening, to then determine the prioritization of projects, as opposed to just looking in isolation at a sourcing event. Yes, the data can still be insightful there, but you get far more benefit, I think, the further up you go in terms of your planning process, in knowing where the opportunities may be because of where the risks are because of the changing conditions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, it's great to have your roadmap and your plan and to have all those waves and know what you're going after. But reality is, things are ever changing. So you have to be able to react when it's best for that particular, category, because you're hedging against what you see coming, or just because you see this is a great time to be able to reopen a category and seek to put strong contracts in place. Absolutely.
Kelly, I'm going to come over to you just to see if we've got any questions from the audience yet today.
We have gotten some questions, and actually it's interesting because I think everyone must be coming to this conversation with the mindset of sort of turbulence that we've seen over the last couple of years. Sherri, maybe I'll start with you on this question, and then Kristen, of course, you can add in. Just generally about the perishability of market intelligence these days. You mentioned government sources. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag on those being gathered versus when they're published. But even things that we see go by on a news site or are published in a business journal or some kind of industry publication, what would you say, just very generally, about the current lifespan of data and intel that procurement might have access to right now?
I think that's a great question, Kelly. Thanks for forwarding that on to us. I think the perishability, the fungibility of market intelligence data is always something to monitor and manage, and I think it never more than right now. Typically, one of the biggest lags we have is on labor data, though that's both a problem and something that's not as hard to manage as it sounds, because typically we don't see great fluctuations like we are right now in terms of labor. Labor always lags about 60 days, whereas finished goods lag more about a 30-day lag. I think that we're in extraordinarily volatile markets right now. And so when I tell you I have information from 30 days ago, you're like, well, is that today? Whereas for like the last 5 years, that would have been extraordinarily timely. So I think that I would say, yes, it is a problem. Yes, it has to be monitored and managed. And yes, we have to also step back and look at things on a little bit more of an arm's length perspective and recognize that things are changing and we are reacting, and we have to keep reacting to them, but it's not real time. It's not minute by minute. The contracts that we're managing, the projects that we're managing aren't really probably changing minute to minute unless we're looking at some kind of a futures track, which for us in procurement is probably more of a predictor of where prices are going than an actuality of where prices are today. Does that make sense? Does that answer that?
I think it does. No, I absolutely think it does. And Kristen, one of the other questions that has come in, I think this is a response to your comment about validating intel or category specific input from stakeholders. A couple of people are asking questions in the area of how formal do you recommend procurement try to be around gathering that information from different stakeholders within the business and then purposefully going out and validating it? Is it just sort of like a gut check, make sure that this information makes sense, run it against something, or do you advocate that procurement do something a little bit more formal, whether it's around documentation or recommunicating the information back to somebody else internally? Any thoughts about the formality of that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it needs to be formal, and I am a big advocate, and as a firm we're a big advocate when we work with our clients of what we call gate meetings. So before we get to a sourcing strategy and we've gone through the effort of analyzing the marketplace and pulling the external data and talking with all of the stakeholders internally, we bring everyone together internally, all of the stakeholders kind of up, down, left and right, through the chain, and we talk about what we found, right? We help educate everyone so that we are on, a level playing field, singing from the same song sheet, and have a clear understanding that we're all aligned to about what's actually happening and how that information helps to build our strategy. So I do think it is something that you need to formally document, have conversations about with all of your stakeholders, let them ask questions and challenge or agree with what you're putting together so that together you have a team strategy. It's not a procurement strategy, right? We're not working in a silo. All of those stakeholders need to be with me throughout the process. And that's one of the ways that we get everybody on board at the very, very beginning.
Great point. Absolutely. It can't just be a procurement strategy. I think that's an excellent piece of advice.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And of course, I see some other questions coming in, so we're definitely going to come back to you again in a few minutes. Thank you. I have a question that we got in advance. I'm going to ask this to you, Kristen. It's from James. James asks, how do you set organizational expectations for supply chain impacts that you can't control? So I'm thinking, cost increases, volatility, perhaps relaying bad messages within the organization. Like any approaches that you've found to be more successful than others in doing that?
Those gate meetings that I just mentioned, that is my main methodology for ensuring communication internally. So we check in early on as we're developing our strategies. We're checking in after we've conducted RFPs to talk about, who's responded, what is the initial scoring looking like, and what our negotiation strategies are. And those are formal, right? Those are formal check-ins as we go throughout the process. But we have to collaborate internally throughout the process and frequently to make sure that, you know, the cross-functional teams that we have internally are in the loop, right? So as things change, as Sherri mentioned, that, you know, data that's 30 days, you know, old is now old, right? It could be outdated. Your strategies might change, right? And you need to be able to pivot very quickly throughout the process based on what's happening in the market. So as much as you know, are marching down and trying to execute a particular strategy, you have to have enough flexibility built in that if there are dramatic changes within the marketplace, that you can react accordingly. And the only way you can do that is to be in sync with all of your stakeholders, so that when you get to the end, right, when you're ready to award contracts, they're aligned.
How about when you have a cost increase request that comes in from a supplier, you know, mid-contract? I think that it's always difficult to pass that news on to stakeholders, but any advice or recommendations on things that have worked, perhaps even what data that you may want to accompany that bad news with to a stakeholder?
Sure. We've had that happen a lot recently. And a lot of contracts don't necessarily provide you with protection, right, if that's happening. Or if they do, they're certainly, you know, primarily on the upside, and they're not two-way, that you can adjust pricing down as well. You know, my position with, you know, the majority of the suppliers that I work with is we have to be a partnership, right? We can't just be looking to, you know, really play hardball with suppliers and not understand their positions and the impacts, because if the price increases are validated, right, if I can confirm that I see where this is coming from, you've showed me the indices that you're tracking to and how they've gone up and how that inputs into our price, I can accept that, right? And I need you to continue being a supplier with us so that we can continue, you know, our business. On the other side, this is also a great time to explore. I think, Sherri, you brought this up earlier. You know, what are all of my contracts like in this space, and how can I build in that buffer, right? How can I include additional suppliers to help me whenever market conditions are in such flux? How can I make sure that I'm mitigating risk throughout and managing the costs versus just being tied to one particular supplier? If I have that option, I want to have that option for additional partnerships and to mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree, and to just kind of tag onto that, Kristen, I think that when we were talking about that, we had this situation just occur with us, and one of the things that we thought about was, you know, this is a really super challenging environment, and I don't know that it's ever first in our list to be really you know, hard case counterparty. But certainly in this challenging environment we have now, what will happen when you're a real hard case counterparty is that you may have supplier default. They just may walk off and go. And you know, that's a bad scene even in times of plenty. But in times of shortage, that's a real bad scene where suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, you know, supplier A went down, so I'll just reach this, wait, who do I reach to? I mean, it's that kind of a thing. And so I think this cooperative nature to try to work through these challenging environments isn't natural. It just must happen. I think what Kristen and I were talking about in context of the client project we had was that we want to reach a balance, or we would advocate reaching a balance between, you know, you don't want all of the risk of these challenging price increases to be on you as the buyer, but you also must realistically realize you can't push all of that risk onto your supplier either. So that means going back to some of the fundamental things that we spoke about earlier, which is looking at index-based contracts, reviewing to make sure that those indices points are appropriate and practical and still where they should be. You know, base hits, batting, you know, fundamentals of you know, how are those being calculated? How often are they being calculated? Are they being averaged? Is freight being broken out? All of those little particular tactical kind of things become even more sharply focused, I think, in a rising cost environment than perhaps they had been in the last few months or years.
Now you mentioned, sorry, Sherri, you mentioned index-based pricing there, and that's one of those tactics that you know, when you think about the intention, it can bring some fairness in terms that it's measured by an external, there's an external measure that's kind of influencing the pricing that you have in a contract. But I wonder if there's, you know, is that something that we should be using all the time, or is index-based pricing something that's relevant only in certain conditions, or perhaps any warning signs that we need to be aware of when we think about going down the route of index-based pricing?
Kristen, do you want to take that first, or you want me to respond? What do you think?
You know what? Go ahead. I'll chime in. Go ahead.
I think there's always a place for index-based pricing, but then again, I'm a market analyst and I like things to be responsive in that way. There is some risk to it. There's a risk in that it feels, and you'll hear a lot of people anecdotally say, index-based pricing, I don't know, it gives me indigestion because it always goes up, it doesn't go down, right? But I think in a rising cost environment, it is a great tool to manage costs. As I mentioned before, we can look at those on a monthly adjustment. We can look at them on quarterly average adjustments. We can look at semi-annual adjustments. We can do a lot of things around that way. So I think they're a great tool to validate and to kind of coordinate and manage a rising cost environment. That's my 2 cents on it. Kristen, you want to jump to?
I agree with you. I think, you know, one of the clients that I'm working with now, an IT agreement that we're looking at, and, you know, a lot of times IT maintenance agreements are tied to CPI or 5%, right? And it's been a great thing, right? It's worked out really well until this year, right? And their budgetary planning did not budget for, you know, over 5% for increases. So it's really put them in a bind. So I think it's again going back to kind of the fundamentals of procurement, right? And recognizing the volatility and having contingency plans and structure in place, and not just thinking, oh, you know, just add 3% to my budget year over year and I'll be fine. That's not the case right now. And some of these, you know, escalations are quite costly. So as much as I love tying them to indices, and I think it really helps, putting it into practice and planning and budgeting is challenging this year, I think, for many organizations.
It does give you a great mechanism and a great opportunity to work more closely in partnership with your suppliers, which is sort of the name of the game, I think, that we're seeing, and you know, that makes sense both in theory and in practice.
You know, speaking as a practitioner, and again, this is the non-technical term, but it kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies sometimes, thinking that you're not necessarily in control of the pricing, because, you know, it's going to be influenced by an outside factor that ultimately you can't control. Now, the reality is that in environments like this, that's the case anyway, but it's almost like there isn't a filter from which that price increases gets passed on to you, because
I think
you don't have
absolutely fair criticism, but I would parry that back and say that the index is reflective of the reality. So whether you thought you had control of the pricing or not, you probably didn't, because if we see pricing going up, you know, by 100%, it's going to hit you either way. So at least this way, you have a bit of an independent sounder. But again, that's market intelligence point of view.
Now, Kristen, you know, when you have these, you talked about the budgeting process and budgeting planning. Are you seeing folks be able to pass on these increases into pricing, into stronger pricing? So, you know, procurement starting to work more closely with account and sales and BD teams to mitigate the impact of these increases, rather than an organization having to, you know, swallow the impact on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're all working creatively together. We have to, right? And again, this is having a seat at the table right now, and you know, being asked early on in the game and the planning process of, you know, what can we do? How should we structure this to be most successful, to, you know, keep pricing down and not as variable? And it's been, I think, a welcome change in many cases that, you know, we are adding that value and having those conversations early to be able to continually demonstrate we're not just processing POs, right? That's not procurement. there's a lot more to it. And if we're engaged early and working collaboratively with all of the different departments, then we can really put together strong contracts that they're able to, leverage year over year and have a lot more, continuity of the supply that they have, of the labor that they're seeking, and managing the process throughout.
Kelly, I'm going to come back to you again in a moment with for some other questions that we're receiving in from the audience. And again, I'll just encourage you, if you do have any questions, please pop them in there. With the time where it is, it's probably going to be the last time I get the opportunity to ask Kelly. But while you do that, Kristen, I have a question that came from Magdalena, and it came in advance of today's conversation. Magdalena asks, so we've talked about index-based pricing. What is the most effective strategy within your contract of actually combating price volatility? Or are there other tactics that you can think about using when you're contracting to at least mitigate some of the impact or protect against the volatility?
Yeah, I mean, there's not one answer. Category by category, you've got to approach things differently. So, I think right now we're really focused on managing the risk, right? That's really important right now. So whereas before we were seeking just to drive costs down, right now it's, how can we make sure that we are competitive in the pricing that we're getting, right? And that we're structuring it in a way that there is some consistency. Yeah. I think a lot of what Sherri and I have been talking about recently is changing our mindset, right? So not everything's going to be just in time. So our procurement strategies have had to adjust, right? We're talking about, does it make sense to increase our inventory right now, right? That hasn't been something that we've really been talking about, but if it helps to mitigate risk, if it helps you to be able to, buy now while perhaps pricing is at a competitive place, then let's do it. For new agreements, looking to build in, the index-based pricing, creating should cost modeling in your RFP structure so that you're breaking down the cost components and have more of an ability to, flex and adjust. It's just a different mindset, right? And it's taking a lot more thoughtful planning and moving beyond that instant gratification of kind of the Amazon world of I can place an order and it'll be here in 2 hours, and I can look at 5 different retailers to see which one has the least cost. It's much more procurement fundamentals of getting, the right product in the right place at the right time at the right cost, kind of all of those things that we're working towards when we create our procurement strategies.
So go ahead, Sherri.
Oh, I was just gonna kind of build on what Kristen was saying. I think that, it wasn't really even that many years ago that we had that it took us a little while to do that. And thinking of Amazon, I thought was a great example that you gave, Kristen, because that's something that we've all become real commonplace, and convenience is that kind of a thing. If you think about it, convenience is always easy to get used to. And so, we drove to this point where we had these super efficient supply chains that originated half a world away, and we had just-in-time inventory that involved ocean freight. And I think I mentioned to you the other day that sounds kind of oxymoronic, really, kind of like jumbo shrimp, just-in-time ocean freight. That's kind of crazy, right? So I think that we had stretched that efficiency out really far, but perhaps that pendulum needed to come back a little bit more towards resiliency anyway. I've been sort of thinking that this COVID thing was a great catalyst and perhaps an accelerator of that course correction. But it probably, the trends of having us sort of come back a little bit from the far edge of efficiency were probably already in place. But today we don't have the luxury of doing that anymore. But we started off talking today about what a challenging circumstances that we're in and that we're all working with. But with that challenge comes that opportunity that Kristen's been talking about for the supply chain. I think that there's short-term things that we've talked about, whether it's indexing or adding suppliers or dealing with an increased inventory, that even just a year ago would have been met with a lot of skepticism. And today, those are just considered like immediate mitigators. But then I think the opportunity for supply chain and for procurement to step up and to have a seat at the table with some more midterm or even long-term things is there. That opportunity is there, and we are in procurement are the ones that are providing those solutions and providing that coverage.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, Sherri, one of the things that I like to be able to look at is, so often, and we talk about the events, right? Like we do the sourcing event and we award the contracts, right? And it's very blocks, and turning that into having a rolling renewal process, right? I had, 6 partners for this particular category, and every, year, 6 months, there's another contract that I'm seeking to renegotiate, renew, bid out, but it's always bringing fresh perspective in versus them being very like periods of time. We can be a lot more flexible and adjust more to what the current state is if we have more of a rolling renewal process too.
I think so, and I think procurement's is now and is going to be even more invited to the table, even in longer term strategy talks, like even in designing, designing packaging, designing freighting, designing products that are kind of coming in that way, and assessing things around functionality and how that's going to go. Whereas before, procurement's always and oftentimes traditionally was sort of just the sourcer, just, here's the plan, get this done. Now today it might be, well, wait a minute, this plan involves, this risk, it would be difficult to get that should this factory shut down or should this commodity price spike. Whereas I don't know that was always a given, that sourcing teams would have that early voice or be given that early opportunity.
Yeah. And, even more than collaboratively working with our stakeholders internally, one of my clients, last year, we were working on water treatment chemicals, not the super glamorous category, but very important to them. And they had been buying the same chemicals over and over. And one of their suppliers that they had been working with said, one of your competitors uses this, right? How about we come out, we test it. It's 30% less. It can do all of these other things, right? And the suppliers were bringing that innovation to us as well, because they wanted to continue finding ways to earn business and making sure that they were kind of keeping up with the marketplace. It ended up that it worked in some cases for us, not in others, but I think we have to innovate internally and innovate with our partners and our suppliers as well, because the opportunity is out there, right? And when you work together collaboratively and you're partnering and you view each other as strategic partners and not, supplier customer, the world opens up a bit more.
I think about it from a procurement perspective as like we're operating as this flywheel, this flywheel of continuous improvement. We're involved in the entire kind of life cycle, and everything that we do kind of builds on each other. So it makes it stronger as you get more and more integrated into a category or into ultimately, not necessarily even on a category basis, but what are the outcomes the business needs and how can we help fulfill them, as opposed to a linear process where we just think about sourcing. It's an event, it starts with something, it ends at something. Then we move on to the next sourcing process. And that helps, thinking of it as that circular kind of involvement, I think brings so much impact and has a lot more potential for procurement. I do want to go to Kelly. Kelly, I have one last question I want to come back to as time allows, but Kelly, do we have anything else that's coming from the audience today?
So we do, and actually I think what I'd like to do, Kristen, I'll start with you, but then Sherri, I'll put the same question to you because I think you will bring different perspectives to this. We've understandably talked a lot about how to handle cost volatility with current suppliers, current contracts, current categories. But given what procurement has seen and learned over the last 18 months, are there ways for us to evolve the way we look at how a prospective supplier manages their costs, how a prospective supplier manages their risk, and factor that into the selection process? In existing categories and contracts, we're kind of stuck with however good or strategic or successful our current suppliers are, or how protective our current contracts are. But can we start saying, okay, we recognize that not only do we have to have a better grasp on costs, but we want our suppliers to have a better grasp and a better plan for risk mitigation. And that should be a higher priority factor in selecting suppliers. Have you seen any examples of companies even taking things that have gone wrong and learning from them to strengthen their selection process to build a little bit more resilience into the supply chain going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the biggest failures are what help us to find that next successful way to move forward. So absolutely. And I like to think of those non-incumbent partners. I always refer to them as challengers, right? I want them to come in and challenge the way we're thinking about how we do things today, how we're structuring agreements today, and help us to kind of move to that next level. So I love the idea of always, opening up the doors and hearing about different ways to do things and questioning, our current business processes, right? Is there a better way? How can we take, this incredibly, one-sided agreement, let's say, right, where we've had a lot of problems with it in the past year, and structure it in a different way, and what other suppliers and partners might be a better fit for us as we think through doing business in a more strategic manner, right?
Sherri, from your perspective with actually doing the research with the data, how specific would you expect procurement to be able to be with suppliers on this front? So, I mean, it would be one thing to say, okay, tell me, do you have a risk mitigation plan? Or tell me the kinds of things you generally do to manage your costs in advance. Or should we try to be more specific in understanding how these suppliers are protecting themselves and therefore us against disruption?
Kelly, I think this is a really good question, and I think Kristen had a very balanced and thoughtful answer. I'm going to add on to that a little bit and say that it kind of, I think first off, there's a theory and a practice here, okay? And we're always trying to look to balance that out a little bit. And Kristen can come back and add on to that in just a moment. But essentially what we're kind of doing here is we're balancing risk, we're managing risk, which is really what a challenging environment requires us to do across many different specters. So I think that do you have this process? How do you mitigate this risk? What are the degrees of exposure do you have? I think all of that is standard on all RFPs to all suppliers. But then I think you have to really spend some time thinking and identifying and prioritizing, because you have these limited resources, right? There's only so many procurement hours and there are so many procurement teams, and you're looking at all of this type of stuff. And that's where I think you see what your primary guys are and your greatest exposures, and then you kind of try to drill that through a little bit. And I know I used this example the other day on a separate different conversation, that I think it's an important exercise to look through all of your supplier base and rationalization of suppliers. That's been a go-to for a long time. But even very, very solid suppliers, and I use the example of Ford, who you've been buying Explorer trucks for 30 years and never missed a delivery, all of a sudden could be a thing, right? Okay, so I think you've got to go back and look at all of that. I feel like that's a somewhat convoluted answer to you, Kelly, but I think it's a combination of that as it goes. Kristen, can you help me clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it's about being transparent and vulnerable with each other, right? Like, we have to share our challenges and be very clear in what we're seeking and what we're able to put into an agreement and how we structure it with our suppliers, right? And they've got to do the same back to us. So if we have challenges in being able to, plan in advance and not give them the runway that they need, then they're going to have to build in some protections on their side. So I think a lot of it is, collaboration and partnership and just being transparent with each other, right? Make it a win-win situation, and long-standing partnership with your suppliers. Think of it that way, and how can we both be successful and both feel good about the outcome of this agreement? And I think that that's, one of the best ways to try and work in this type of environment.
Yeah, we're certainly not suggesting that you put your street smarts on a shelf and become a naive buyer by any means, but we are recognizing that today is a challenging circumstance, and cooperation is what's going to get us, through the deep water. And I just really believe that. I think, we have to identify our primary suppliers, and we have to partner with them, and hand in hand, like I said, navigate these shores that we just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
No, you mentioned something about Ford, which pricked my ears up. I started my procurement career in Ford, and then into Tier 1. And back in those days, I shudder to think what would happen if there was potentials for us to close down a factory because of supply chain issues, and it was very much a one-sided conversation that had a lot of penalties on the other side of the contract if you did that, and how that just doesn't fly today because, there are so many. That collaboration is because there's so many challenges. If you're not collaborating, then that's really, you've almost got no chance but to avoid things like that if you're not going into it in a collaborative way.
Agreed.
Now we've only got a couple of minutes left, so no pressure, but you're kind of on the clock with us. Last question. I'm going to pose it to you, Sherri, but I think it's an important question that I just want to make sure we at least touch on today. Kristen earlier mentioned about should cost models as a way of understanding. I think it's a really good way of understanding how realistic a cost increase request is, because if you start to understand and break down the cost models and the input costs, you can kind of see how much input impacts any particular market on your overall cost. The question really is how much market intelligence is required to actually build a successful should cost model? Is it something you can do with the bare minimum of information, or do you need, a huge big model and it's going to take you a long time to get that data to be able to build it?
Well, I'll answer this, and then I'll toss the ball over to Kristen's court again, and we'll collaboratively partner on this, Philip. I think that what you get out is largely what you've put in. Mm-hmm. If you have a simplistic model, it has benefits around being quick to do and not complex to understand or communicate. But your results are simplistic as well. So I think to get really strong should cost modeling is a relatively complex thing, and it's beyond just the exploded diagram. And then you have to have market intelligence that then supports all of those calculations. I know I got a warning just here on time, so I'm going to bump over to Kristen and let her have a bite at that apple.
No, I agree with you 100%. I love the opportunity to use should cost model, but managing them and making sure that you're constantly, in sync, right, mm-hmm. and have the information is time consuming. So you have to balance the right time of where am I going to get the most value and the most protection out of creating this type of agreement and modeling it this way, and building that into, the overall team's role is contract management, and that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of variance in should modeling, and so they can be complex, and complex means time.
Mm-hmm.
I could talk about should cost modeling for the next 10 minutes, but I know that I'll be playing my own music to take me off stage if I do. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We do have questions that we didn't get a chance to ask. I see from Helen, from Verana, from Jeannie, from Ade. So I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to your questions today. Sherri and Kristen, I want to thank you so much for answering the questions that we did get, and just for sharing the benefits of your experience with us today. So thank you for joining us.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.